Well, in a way, Daniel's got it all, because it's a bit like two books. It's got two sections. So the first 6 chapters are narrative, they're stories, and within that we've got some really famous stories, well-known stories. So there's the story of, well, the most well-known is Daniel in the lion's den, but there's also the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and the famous story, another one, of Belshazzar's feast, which is where we get this famous expression about the writing on the wall, a ghostly hand which appears writing 4 words in Hebrew, the writing on the wall as it's called.
Daniel is probably my favourite story from the Old Testament. In order to understand what's going on in Daniel, you need to imagine people who are surrounded, people who are feeling trapped under pressure. It's written to encourage the people of Israel that God is still looking after them, even though they are under foreign oppression. So this particular situation is the situation of exile in Babylon.
So in this first section we've got these stories, so that's chapters 1 to 6, and then in the second section, so that's chapters 7 to 12, what we have here is a series of visions that Daniel has, and these are weird and wonderful.
The way that it tries to encourage the people of Israel is by showing stories about Daniel and his friends, and showing how, despite the most severe threats and persecution, God looks after his people.
Well, let me give you a really important vision. So in Daniel 7, we have a vision that includes the Son of Man, as it's called. In the New Testament we hear Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man, and there's a big question about what this title means. And one background for it comes from Daniel 7 here in the vision, where, here in Daniel 7 verse 13, Daniel says, "As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, or a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship." So part perhaps of the background to Jesus' understanding of himself as a Son of Man in the New Testament, in the Gospels, but this is hotly disputed and a matter of much debate.
So Daniel is depicted as one of the first people who were brought into exile. The way that this happened was that some of the best young men of Israel were brought over to Babylon as, I guess you could call them prisoners of war in a way, and but they were brought into the society in a way, and educated and included within Babylonian society, and so Daniel had quite a significant position and was among the wise men of Babylon, is the term it's used in Daniel itself.
I just saw, as I was looking at Daniel 7 there, another image, another part of the vision, and this forms part of the background for thinking of God as a big white figure, the traditional view. So the idea of God as some white figure clothed in white in heaven somewhere. So Daniel says in chapter 7 verse 9, "As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one," or the Ancient of Days, that is a term used to refer to God, "he took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool." It's the idea of his clothing white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. You can see that setting up well for sort of some kind of Sunday school thing where you actually do use wool for God's hair, that kind of thing.
I guess the most famous story in Daniel is the story of Daniel and the lion's den. A law is made that no one is allowed to pray except to the king, and Daniel decides not to obey that law, and there are people among the rulers who hate Daniel and want him brought down, and so they see that this is happening and they tell the king, and the king actually likes Daniel, so he's disappointed by that. Anyway, Daniel has to be punished, and so he's thrown into the lion's den, and what happens is that the king is worried about him all night long. He goes back in the morning to check how Daniel's gone, and it turns out God has looked after him and has kept him safe.
So the writing on the wall comes in the context of chapter 5 of Daniel and Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar sets up this a festival, and it's some kind of Babylonian festival, some kind of orgy-like thing, lots of drinking, lots of wine, big feast, that kind of thing. And at this feast, Belshazzar remembers something that has happened in the past, which is when the Babylonians went to Jerusalem originally, perhaps in 605 BC, they took from the Jerusalem temple some of the silver and gold vessels. And we read about this in Daniel chapter 1. And they steal these vessels and bring them back to Babylon. Now, Belshazzar remembers this, and at his brilliant feast, which has got everything, he decides that it would be great to use some of these vessels from the Jerusalem temple to drink from. So he summons them, and they arrive, and they use this as part of the feast. But of course, this is sacrilegious. It's already in Daniel. We've seen various stories where the God of Israel has shown himself to the Babylonian kings. Now, as a result, what happens, and I'll read you from verse 5 of chapter 5, they're sitting at this feast, and immediately, it says, the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. It's this mysterious writing, a hand, or some fingers that have appeared, writing these words on the wall. And what's interesting is that this is where our expression, the writings on the wall, actually comes from. So you've probably heard that expression, meaning there's a kind of imminent doom or an unavoidable disaster that's coming. And it actually comes straight here from Daniel 5.
What did it say?
Should I say what the writing actually says? Yeah. So what we read a bit later in Daniel 5 is that the writing on the wall says this: Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And then Daniel is called to interpret this, and he says, this is the interpretation. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And again in verse 26, we have another expression that's common in our English language. It's verse 27, the idea of being weighed, measured and found wanting. So it's another expression you may have heard.
3 friends are called Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and they again, it's the same sort of tale. That is that they are persecuted, they end up being convicted, and they're thrown as a punishment into a fiery furnace that was heated up so hot that even the people who threw them in got consumed by the flames. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are in the fire. They're walking around alive without being harmed by the flames, and there's a 4th figure in there as well, who the reader might take to be God or an angel, somehow looking after those and keeping them completely safe. And in the end, they're vindicated, while their accusers are thrown into the fire. So we get this reversal happening again and again in Daniel,